I'm sorry, that was just horrible. His friendly gray eyes closed forever. Alright, let's get through the rest of it. Alright, where was I? At first I couldn't believe my dog was dead. I started talking to him. Please don't die, Dan, I said. Don't leave me now. I looked to Mama for help. Her face was as white as the bark on a sycamore tree, and the hurt in her eyes tore at my throat. She opened her mouth to say something, but the words wouldn't come out. Feeling as cold as an Arctic wind, I got up and stumbled to a chair. Mama came over and said something. Her words were only a murmur in my ears. Very gently, Papa picked up old Dan up in his arms and carried him out on the porch. When he came back in the house, he said, "Well, we did all we could do. I guess it wasn't enough." I had never seen my father and mother look so tired and weary as they did on that night. I knew they wanted to comfort me, but didn't know what to say. Billy, Papa tried. "Billy," he said, "I wouldn't think too much about this if I were you. It's not good to hurt like that. I believe I'd just try to forget it. Besides, you still have little Ann." I wasn't even thinking about little Ann at that moment. I knew she was all right. "I'm thankful that I still have her," I said, "but how can I forget old Dan? He gave his life for me. That's what he did. Just laid down his life for me. How can I ever forget something like that?" Mama said, "It's been a terrible night for all of us. Let's go to bed and try to get some rest. Maybe we'll all feel better tomorrow." "No, Mama," I said. "You and Papa go to bed. I think I'll stay up for a while. I couldn't sleep anyway." Mama started to protest, but Papa shook his head. Arm in arm, they walked from the room. Long after my mother and father had retired, I sat by the fire trying to think and couldn't. I felt numb all over. I knew my dog was dead, but I couldn't believe it. I didn't want to. One day they were both alive and happy. Then that night, just like that, one of them was dead. I didn't know how long I had been sitting there when I heard a noise out on the porch. I got up and walked over to the door and listened. It came again, a low whimper and a scratchy sound. I could think of only one thing that could have made the noise. It had to be my dog. He wasn't dead. He'd come back to life. With a pounding heart, I opened the door and stepped out on the porch. What I saw was more than I could stand. The noise I had heard had been made by little Ann. All her life she had slept by old Dan's side, and although he was dead, she had left the doghouse, had come back to the porch, and snuggled up close to his side. She looked up at me and whimpered. I couldn't stand it. I didn't know how I was running until I tripped and fell. I didn't know I was running until I tripped and fell. I got to my feet and ran on, down through our fields of shocked corn until I fell face down on the river's bank. There in the gray shadows of a breaking dawn, I cried until I could cry no more. The chirring of gray squirrels in the bright morning told me it was daylight. I got to my feet and walked back to the house. Coming up through our barn lot, I saw my father feeding our stock. He came over and said, "Breakfast is about ready." "I don't want any breakfast, Pop," I said. "I'm not hungry and I have a job to do. I'll have to bury my dog." "I'll tell you what," he said. I'm not going to be very busy today, so let's have a good breakfast and then I'll help you." "No, Papa," I said. "I'll take care of it. You go and eat breakfast. Tell Mama I'm not hungry." I saw a hurt look in my father's eyes. Shaking his head, he turned and walked away. From rough pine slabs, I made a box for my dog. It was a crude box, but it was the best I could do. With strips of burlap and corn shucks, I padded the inside. Up on the hillside, at the foot of a beautiful red oak tree, I dug his grave. There were the wild mountain flowers. There the wild mountain flowers would grow in the spring, I laid him away. I had a purpose in burying my dog up there in the hillside. It was a beautiful spot. From there one could see the country for miles, the long white crooked line of the river, the tall thick timber of the bottoms, the sycamore, birch, the box elder. I thought perhaps that on moonlight nights old Dan would be able to hear the deep voices of the hounds as they rolled out of the river bottoms in the frosty air. After the last shovel of dirt was patted in the place, I sat down and let my mind drift back through the years. I thought of the old KC baking powder can, and the first time I saw my pups in that box at the depot. I thought of the $50, the nickels and dimes, and the fishermen in the blackberry patches. I looked at his grave and said with tears in my eyes, I voiced these words: "You were worth it, old friend, and 1,000 times over." In my heart I knew that there in the grave lay a man's best friend. 2 days later, when I came in from the bottoms where my father and I were clearing land, my mother said, "Billy, you had better look after your dog. She won't eat." I started looking for her. I went to the barn, the corn crib, and looked under the porch. I called her name. It was no use. I rounded up my sisters and asked if they had seen little Ann. The youngest one said she had seen her go down into the garden. I went there calling her name. She wouldn't answer my call. I was about to give up, and then I saw her. She had wiggled her way far back under the thorny limbs of a blackberry bush in the corner of the garden. I talked to her and tried to coax her out. She wouldn't budge. I got down on my knees and crawled back to her. As I did, she raised her head and looked at me. Her eyes told the story. They weren't the soft gray eyes I had looked into so many times. They were dull and cloudy. There was no fire, no life. I couldn't understand. I carried her back to the house. I offered her food and water. She wouldn't touch it. I noticed how lifeless she was. I thought perhaps she had a wound I had overlooked. I felt and probed with my fingers. I could find nothing. My father came and looked at her. He shook his head and said, "Billy, it's no use. The life has gone out of her. She has no will to live." He turned and walked away. I couldn't believe it. I couldn't. With eggs and rich cream I made a liquid. I pried her mouth open and poured it down. She responded to nothing I did. I carried her to the porch and laid her in the same place I had laid the body of old Dan. I covered her with gunny sacks. All through the night I would get up and check on her. Next morning I took warm, fresh milk, and again I opened her mouth and fed her. It was a miserable day for me. At noon it was the same. My dog had just given up. There was no will to live. That evening when I came in from the field, she was gone. I hurried to my mother. Mama told me she had seen her go up the hollow from the house, so weak she could hardly stand. Mama had watched her until she had disappeared in the timber. I hurried up the hollow, calling her name. I called and called. I went up to the head of it, still calling her name and praying she would come to me. I climbed out onto the flats, looking, searching, and calling. It was no use. My dog was gone. I had a thought, a ray of hope. I just knew I'd find her at the grave of old Dan. I hurried there. I found her lying on her stomach, her hind legs stretched out straight and her front feet folded back under her chest. She had laid her head on his grave. I saw the trail where she had dragged herself through the leaves. There where she lay, I thought she was still alive. I called her name. She made no movement. With the last ounce of strength in her body, she had dragged herself to the grave of old Dan. Kneeling down by her side, I reached out and touched her. There was no response, no whimpering cry or friendly wag of her tail. My little dog was dead. I laid her head in my lap and with tear-filled eyes gazed up into the heavens. In a choking voice I asked, "Why'd they have to die? Why must I hurt so? What have I done wrong?" I heard a noise behind me. It was my mother. She sat down and put her arm around me. "You've done no wrong, Billy," she said. "I know this seems terrible, and I know it hurts, but at one time or another, everyone suffers. Even the good Lord suffered while he was here on earth. It's true." "I know, Mama," I said, "but I can't understand. It was bad enough when old Dan died. Now little Anna's gone. Both of them gone, just like that." "Billy, you haven't lost your dogs altogether," Mama said. "You always have their memory. Besides, you can have some more dogs." I rebelled at this. "I don't want any more dogs," I said. "I won't ever want another dog. They wouldn't be like old Dan and little Ann." "We all feel that way, Billy," she said. "I do especially." "They fulfilled a prayer that I thought I would never be answered. I don't believe in prayers anymore," I said. "I've prayed for my dogs and now look, both of them are dead." "He's probably just grieving." Believe me, I felt that way when my dog died. Mama was silent for a moment. Then in a gentle voice she said, "Billy, sometimes it's hard to believe that things like this can happen, but there's always an answer. When you're older, you'll understand better." "No, I won't," I said. "I don't care if I'm 100 years old. I'll never understand why my dogs had to die." As if she were talking to someone far away, I heard her say in a low voice, "I don't know what to say. I can't seem to find the right words." Looking up to her face, I saw that her eyes were flooded with tears. "Mama, please don't cry," I said. "I didn't mean what I said." "I know you didn't," she said, and as she squeezed me up tight. "It's just your way of fighting back." I heard the voice of my father calling to us from the house. "Come now," Mama said. "I have supper ready and your father wants to talk to you. I think when you've heard what he has to say, you'll feel better." "I can't leave little Ann like this, Mama," I said. "It'll be cold tonight. I think I'll carry her back to the house." "No, I don't think you should do that," Mama said. "Your sisters will all go to pieces. Let's make her comfortable here." Raking some dead leaves into a pile, she picked little Ann up and laid her in them. Taking off my coat, I spread it over her body. I dread to think of what I have to do